It began with a case the public thought they already understood. A straightforward report, a clear initial narrative, and a community that believed the file was ready to close. But when investigators finalized a report on Rob Reiner, silent details inside those pages shifted the tone of the entire story. What once appeared ordinary began to fracture under documented evidence. Timestamps that didn't align, statements revised after submission, and physical findings referenced directly in the final report that were never publicly emphasized. Official records list the discovery, the recovery, and the procedural timeline. But within those same documents, a single note stands out, an evidence entry log hours apart from the witness statement that first mentioned it. A detail almost invisible unless read carefully. Case files confirm location photographs, law enforcement summaries, and forensic listings. Yet one item is repeatedly referenced without full context. A personal object found where it shouldn't have been, marked only as recovered. Witness statements submitted days later add another layer. Not contradictory, but different enough to raise questions. A neighbor recalls seeing someone that night, but the direction they mention does not match the route documented in the report. No speculation, only what is written, timestamped, and archived. In a case where every minute was counted, that small inconsistency changed everything. Because when a final report quietly shifts the sequence of events, it forces the story to be retold. Not from assumptions, but from evidence. And within that evidence lies the first turn in this investigation, a truth the official summary mentions only once. A Hollywood home in silence. In the early hours of December 14th, 2025, the property known publicly as the Brentwood residence of filmmaker Rob Reiner remained quiet behind perimeter hedging and controlled access gates. Domestic lighting placed in several rooms was recorded as active based on later police photography, with no sign of forced entry reported in initial incident log submitted by first responders. For investigators, the silence inside the home contrasted sharply with the crime scene that would soon be documented. It becomes clear that 2 fatalities were confirmed inside the property, with both victims classified as deceased due to multiple stab injuries. That detail, contained within the official report summary, set the trajectory for what would be examined as a double homicide within a secured household rather than a home invasion scenario. The Los Angeles Police Department report indicated that entry had been legitimate and unforced, suggesting the assailant had either familial access or had been willingly admitted. Tension within the case structure emerged through the legal conclusion that the alleged offender was a couple's son, identified in filings as Nick Renner, age 32, creating prosecutorial emphasis on an inter-family classification rather than external threat involvement. Coroners later confirmed that both victims sustained numerous stab wounds, although no forensic disclosure within the official report specified the pattern or depth distribution of injuries, leaving such medical detail for trial. The absence of disorder in entry points, combined with a lack of property theft indicators, removed random burglary from immediate consideration. The investigative curiosity shifts toward motive, as official report sources reference reports of a heated argument at a Christmas event one day prior, without specifying whether the dispute was continuous or isolated, leaving evaluative gaps for prosecutorial context. Police photographed from the scene, referenced indirectly in official report form, show multiple sharp force trauma indications without suggesting defensive success sufficient to impede the attacker, suggesting speed of assault or impaired victim capacity. Legal analysts cited California Penal Code 190.2 in early commentary due to the presence of 2 victims in a single act, triggering special circumstance eligibility upon conviction and removing discretionary sentencing below life without parole or capital punishment. The recognition that evidence sufficiency, rather than emotional framing, will govern outcomes as prosecutors pursue first-degree charges grounded in intent, deliberation, and premeditation rather than spontaneous altercation alone. The indictment structure outlined within the official report demonstrates prosecutorial confidence, presenting the use of a knife as deliberate engagement requiring proximity and repeated action, thereby supporting intent theories. The absence of forced entry narrows alternative suspect routes almost entirely, positioning the defendant as primary focus based on circumstance rather than direct forensic match, pending trial evidence. My opinion, presented only for analytical framing and not asserted as fact. It is possible, based on the Christmas event argument referenced one day prior and prior addiction-related family stress included within the official report, that emotional collapse within a domestic environment escalated suddenly. This does not establish motive legally, nor prove premeditation, but may later be used by defense to argue impaired judgment rather than calculated planning. This remains speculative until verified through court testimony. Investigators later confirmed that sentencing outcomes, if convicted, would restrict judicial flexibility between life without parole and death eligibility, although California's moratorium renders execution inactive in practice. Early reporting did not identify a recovered murder weapon publicly, but official report language suggests knife evidence was central to prosecution. As documentation advances to the next chapter, focus transitions from discovery to legal interpretation, where weapon analysis becomes pivotal. The weapon reveals intent. The homicide report filed following the discovery of Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner on December 14, 2025, notes that both victims sustained multiple stab injuries consistent with the use of a single-edged sharp instrument, most likely a household or kitchen knife. Forensic technicians referenced within the official report indicate the pattern of wounds appeared repetitive, with no mention of hesitation marks, a detail that commonly assists investigators in distinguishing uncertainty from decisiveness. The fact emerges that repeated knife use is legally construed as direct engagement, requiring sustained physical action, and therefore supporting prosecutorial inference of intent rather than accident. This interpretive direction becomes central to the legal framing that followed, particularly once special circumstance allegations under California Penal Code 190.2 were applied. Crime scene photographs cited indirectly in official report descriptions show no evidence of forced entry, no overturned furniture indicating extended struggle, and no signs of ransacking. These conditions support the hypothesis that the offender was known to victims and acted within spatial familiarity. Prosecutorial emphasis turns toward the nature of the weapon. A knife demands proximity, pressure, and repetition, elements historically used to argue malice aforethought when contextualized with family access. A firearm, by contrast, might permit distance, but stabbing involves close physical contact and numerous conscious opportunities to withdraw. This distinction, though technical, is deeply relevant to courtroom argumentation. The absence of publicly released details regarding the blade's length, serration, or origin, information important in determining whether the weapon was retrieved impulsively from within the residence or transported to the scene beforehand. A retrieved kitchen knife may indicate escalation during confrontation, while a brought-in knife could imply pre-action consideration. The official report neither confirms recovery location nor forensic residue analysis, which leaves this element deferred to evidence phase proceedings. Prosecutors, however, consistently highlight that every additional wound constitutes a renewed decision to act. Early interviews referenced in the official report mention an argument at a Christmas event one day prior, suggesting emotional stressors but not confirming motive. Post-incident, no signs of self-defense wounds were emphasized in early reporting, though absence of disclosure does not equate to absence of existence, establishing that prosecutorial theory leans on behavioral continuity. Approach, attack, completion, exit, with no immediate medical intervention attempted. In case law, lack of aid or remorseful counteraction after injury infliction is often cited to reinforce intent demonstration. Laboratory examination typically involves swabbing of a knife handle, blade, and surrounding surfaces for blood mixture analysis, fingerprint or touch DNA, though the official report provides no disclosure confirming successful retrieval. Should only victim DNA be present, defense may challenge single weapon certainty. Should defendant DNA appear, prosecution strengthens chain of custody narrative. Knife wounds also allow estimation of attack angle, dominant hand inference, and possible sequence of strikes, factors useful in reconstructing approach pattern. It is possible the weapon originated inside the home, suggesting a conflict escalation rather than pre-armed intrusion. If the knife was taken from a kitchen or accessible household location, this may later surface in defense mitigation to argue impaired judgment rather than pre-entry planning. This remains theoretical pending forensic disclosure. The indictment structure cited previously demonstrates that prosecutors intend to frame this weapon use as deliberate action. Under California first-degree murder standards, deliberation does not require long-term planning. Even moments of reflection may satisfy legal threshold. In the official report, emphasis on multiple stab wounds functions as evidentiary support that the assailant continued despite opportunities to stop. The presence of 2 victims further elevates the charge profile and triggers mandatory sentencing structures if conviction is achieved. As evidentiary hearings progress, the location of the weapon, patterning of injuries, and laboratory findings will determine whether argument leans toward deliberate premeditation or emotional escalation. With knife-based homicides, the blade becomes central to both guilt and sentencing phases. The next chapter transitions from weapon analysis toward identification, classification, and procedural confirmation involving the alleged perpetrator. No intruder, no escape. Initial law enforcement assessment documented that all exterior entry points at the Reiner residence were locked, intact, and undisturbed at the time officers arrived. Windows were reported as closed, glass was unbroken, and no prime markings were noted on frames or door latches. Security gate logs provided no record of unauthorized access, and camera footage referenced within the official report revealed no unidentified individuals entering or exiting during the relevant time frame. The absence of forced entry becomes a foundational point, eliminating intrusion-based theories and directing investigative attention inward toward household connections. This early determination significantly narrowed suspect vectors, removing random burglary and external threat pathways. Homicide detectives conducted a walkthrough of the interior, documenting room condition, object placement, and physical disturbance. Furniture remained upright, valuables were present and unremoved, and there were no indicators of ransacking. Drawer contents, artwork, electronic devices, and personal items were found undisturbed. This scene configuration supports a conclusion that robbery was not a motive, further reinforcing that the attacker entered through familiarity or authorization. No open window screens or damaged locks were reported, which courts often interpret as evidence of internal access rather than covert entry. Investigative curiosity shifts to the absence of escape-related disruption. There were no footprints in landscaping soil, no disturbed gravel patterns near exit points, and no alarms triggered. Forensic teams swabbed doorknobs, railings, and tile surfaces, though the official report does not disclose whether usable fingerprints or DNA profiles were recovered beyond victim presence. This silence may result from withheld discovery prior to trial. Law enforcement commonly withholds details regarding active forensic linkage until evidentiary hearings. Response documentation indicates that first responders located both victims within the residence. Time of death estimation placed the attack within a relatively narrow window before discovery, suggesting the assailant either departed immediately or remained only briefly afterward. With no sign of third-party intrusion and no reported escape trail, investigators increasingly viewed the crime as committed by someone who required neither stealth to enter nor force to exit. This interpreted direction aligns with the subsequent indictment, naming the couple's son, Nick Reiner, as defendant. Police investigators reportedly conducted neighborhood canvassing within the 48 hours following the incident. Interviews were focused primarily on unusual sounds, vehicle movement, late-night visitors, or domestic disturbance reports. Official report references do not indicate that neighbors heard forced struggle sounds, though lack of documentation does not confirm absence. Houses with gated spacing often limit sound travel. Interior blood pattern analysis would later contribute to spatial reconstruction. Stabbing-based homicide scenes typically generate arterial spray, cast-off, and transfer patterns. Clean pathways within the residence can indicate controlled movement by the assailant. Official report references mention multiple wounds, but do not describe whether blood distribution suggests a dynamic struggle or rapid incapacitation. The distinction is evidentiary, not speculative. Security system data, including motion timestamps or internal sensor logs, was not detailed publicly. If security remained active without alerts, this implies access with recognized codes or deactivation by someone familiar with the system. If deactivated earlier, prosecution may frame it as preparatory behavior. Silence regarding forced entry and the presence of an intact interior. It is plausible that entry was voluntary, suggesting the victims either allowed the assailant inside or the assailant already resided there. This theoretical framing aligns with domestic homicide patterns, though confirmation requires courtroom evidence disclosure. Detectives subsequently collected clothing, possible weapon residue, and digital device data for timeline verification. Cell tower pings, vehicle plate reads, and transactional activity often assist in placement analysis. Whether such data directly linked the defendant to the scene remains undisclosed, though the indictment itself indicates prosecutorial confidence in establishing presence. The absence of external intrusion leaves a legal framework focused on access, opportunity, and proximity. When a crime occurs inside a secured residence without structural compromise, burden shifts toward those with relational access. Chapter 4 transitions from environmental reconstruction to timeline development, examining sequencing, last known interactions, and proximity-based opportunity indicators. A son identified. Within hours of the Brentwood double homicide report, detectives focus on household occupants, known visitors, and individuals with routine access to the residence. Routine investigative protocol mandates priority screening of immediate relatives in domestic cases, especially when no forced entry is present. In this case, early reference documents within the official report note that law enforcement turned attention toward Nick Renner, age 32, the son of Rob and Michelle. His identification as a person of interest is not portrayed as speculative in the official report, but rather as a procedural outcome of access, proximity, and opportunity. The absence of intruder indicators created a narrow circle of potential suspects, and familial focus became a logical progression. Investigators reviewed recent interactions between Nick and his parents. Official report narrative notes an argument occurring at a holiday event one day before the incident. While no official motive has been confirmed, early inquiries documented tension surrounding relapse concerns, treatment resistance, or emotional conflict. The suspicion direction intensified due to reported instability and documented addiction history, though no formal statement from law enforcement is included in the official report confirming motive or emotional catalyst. Identification in homicide cases does not equate to guilt, but it does initiate forensic target prioritization. Deepen surrounding Nick's location at estimated time of death. Official report data includes no alibi submission or witness corroboration placing him elsewhere, though non-disclosure does not confirm absence. Law enforcement commonly withholds alibi response status during early investigation. Phone records, vehicle tracking data, or surveillance footage are often used to verify mobility. Whether this evidence exists is not provided, but the indictment suggests investigators establish sufficient linkage to pursue arrests later. Police procedure typically involves voluntary interview invitation when suspicion arises. The official report does not detail whether Nick consented to questioning or if legal representation intervened early. Timeline suggests charges followed rapidly, indicating investigators believed evidence met threshold for probable cause. The prosecutorial filing confirms 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstance allegation, designating Nick as primary defendant and eliminating alternative suspect pathways at charging stage. This legal filing carries weight. Prosecutors rarely file capital-eligible indictments without confidence in evidentiary foundation. Arrest records reference an official report note that law enforcement apprehended Nick away from the crime location. The distance and travel path are not disclosed publicly. If he departed residence following incident, prosecutors may frame departure as flight behavior, indicating consciousness of guilt. If he was later located calmly, defense may interpret conduct as impaired state rather than strategic evasion. The official report remains neutral regarding demeanor or statements during apprehension. Digital device seizure likely followed arrest. Phones, laptops, and cloud accounts serve as repositories of location data, search queries, and communication trails. Investigators may examine recent messages to identify emotional escalation, requests for funds, or conflict evidence. No disclosure findings is present in official report form. Fingerprint and DNA collection would occur during processing. In knife-related homicides, presence of defendant DNA on handle or mixed blood patterns could form evidentiary anchors. Charges imply investigative confidence. Chain of custody remains unreported and would surface during preliminary hearings. It is plausible, based on official report silence around alternative suspects and the rapidity of charging, that investigators possess circumstantial linkage early, possibly through movement logs, communication timelines, or recovered physical evidence. This remains theoretical until publicly verified. Following identification, attention shifts to evidence acquisition. Investigators will compare wound distribution to expected dominant hand angle, analyze clothing for trace exchange, and reconstruct timeline through digital and physical markers. Arrest alone is not conviction. The burden remains prosecutorial. Chapter 5 continues towards statements, contradictions, and early public response, where evidence begins to confront narrative. The final 24 hours. The documented record establishes a final day of Rob and Michelle Reiner's lives as one framed by routine social interaction, interrupted only in retrospect by hints that later became legally significant. On the previous evening, the family attended a Christmas gathering noted in official report references, where a reported argument occurred between their son, Nick Reiner, and the couple. Although the content of the exchange has not been publicly disclosed, multiple reports confirm it was intense enough to draw notice. The dispute stands as the last known interaction with both victims alive in a public setting, forming the first verifiable marker in the investigative timeline. After the event, the family left for their Brentwood residence, arriving without recorded disturbance or documented third-party presence. Forensic assessment suggests that once home, no forced entry took place. Doors, windows, and locking mechanisms remained intact. The official report does not state the hour at which the victims entered their residence, nor does it indicate whether neighbors saw lights active beyond late evening. It becomes important that the official report does not present evidence of external intrusion, tightening investigative focus on individuals with unrestricted access. From this point, the timeline is reconstructed through procedural inference. A return home after the Christmas gathering, internal environment undisturbed. No sign of theft or struggle beyond the fatal assault itself. Shifts toward what occurred inside the home between arrival and the estimated time of death. The medical examiner has not publicly released a formal post-mortem time window, though the official report legal framing confirms the attack occurred overnight leading into December 14th, 2025. Investigators likely used body temperature variance, rigor progression, and stomach content analysis to approximate the attack window, though none of those details appear in official report text. Scene silence suggests no external witness heard distress, whether due to sound isolation or rapid incapacitation. Within one day, family conflict escalated into homicide, without evidence of escape attempt, defense struggle leading outside the scene, or intruder involvement. This compression of time became central to prosecution theory that the killing was not random but domestic. The following morning, discovery likely occurred when routine contact failed. The official report implies the bodies were found within the home, but does not specify by whom or at what hour. It is reasonable that a relative, assistant, or scheduled visitor alerted authorities when communication ceased unexpectedly. Police arrival marks the second fixed point after the party itself. No record is provided regarding Nick's whereabouts during discovery. Whether he remained accessible, unreachable, or already off-site is not stated. Arrests later took place away from the residence, as recorded in official report references. Investigators secured electronics, clothing, and access logs, reconstructing the previous night through data rather than eyewitness timeline. With no intruder traces, the final 24 hours became a closed-loop investigation. Event, conflict, return home, silence, discovery, arrest. The interval between Christmas gathering conflict and homicide suggests a timeline consistent with emotional escalation rather than long-term planning. This does not diminish prosecution's stance on premeditation, but indicates motive formation may have been rapid, internal, and personally driven. This remains hypothetical until court evidence confirms sequencing. In procedural terms, the final 24 hours created the framework for all subsequent filings. A private argument, a secured residence, no forced entry, and an accused son positioned as final known point of relational tension. Chapter 6 moves deeper into statements, silence, and the first legal narrative shaped by what investigators could prove inside that time frame. Charges of exceptional severity. The decision by prosecutors to file 2 counts of first-degree murder against Nick Reiner marked a turning point in the case, elevating public perception and legal consequence simultaneously. Under California law, first-degree murder requires proof of intent, deliberation, and premeditation, thresholds not applied lightly. Court filings described in the official report make clear that these charges were not provisional or exploratory. They reflected a firm prosecutorial stance. It becomes evident that the indictment contained not only dual counts of homicide, but also a special circumstance allegation for multiple murders, placing the case in the most severe statutory category available. The inclusion of a deadly weapon enhancement further expanded the legal gravity. Prosecutors alleged deliberate use of a knife, a close contact instrument, requiring repeated conscious action. This mattered significantly because stabbing homicides allowed juries to infer intent through wound repetition and force application. The cumulative structure of charges signals prosecutorial confidence that the evidence supports premeditation rather than impulsive violence. Once a special circumstance is filed, sentencing options narrow dramatically. If convicted with special circumstance proven, sentencing cannot fall below life without the possibility of parole or the death penalty, though execution remains inactive under California's moratorium. Centers on why prosecutors pursued maximum tier charges so early in proceedings rather than awaiting full discovery review. One explanation is sufficiency of direct or circumstantial evidence, though specific forensic confirmation remains undisclosed publicly. The charging document, as referenced, indicates deliberate legal construction. The combination of first-degree counts, multiple murder special circumstance, and weapon use allegation forms a three-layer statutory lockout. Prosecution chose a charging path that leaves no lesser sentencing outcome, meaning that if guilt is established, the sentence is intended to be permanent. This communicates intent from the state not to negotiate the case downward easily. California Penal Code 190.2 is reserved for the highest risk classifications. Multiple murder qualifies automatically, without requiring financial motive, torture, or additional aggravation. The knife use allegation serves not as a separate charge, but as an amplifier of criminal intent. Courts often instruct juries that repeated stabbing demonstrates deliberation due to conscious repetition inherent in the act. Although mental illness, addiction, or emotional distress may function as mitigation, they rarely negate premeditation when physical conduct confirms sustained action. It is plausible that the prosecutor filed special circumstance immediately to secure maximum leverage before plea negotiation. This does not confirm strategy, but such posture is consistent with cases expected to end in life without parole, without extended debate. Theory only. In capital-eligible trials, burden of proof remains heavy. Prosecutors must demonstrate intent, premeditation, and conduct sequence beyond reasonable doubt. The defense may challenge the special circumstance, arguing lack of prolonged planning or asserting emotional collapse rather than calculated motive. However, the legal design of the indictment suggests prosecutors anticipate supporting evidence through forensic reconstruction, digital trace analysis, or behavioral testimony. Sentencing phase implications appear throughout the official report. Aggravating factors include multiple victims and knife use, while mitigation may involve addiction and mental illness. Juries often weigh narrative framing as strongly as statute, evaluating whether conduct reflects cold intent or psychological deterioration. The official report leans toward interpretation under which life without parole is foreseeable, absent extreme cruelty findings beyond multiple fatal wounds. The indictment severity marked the moment the case transitioned from tragedy to high-stakes legal battle. Chapter 8 will examine early hearings, courtroom posture, and how the prosecution and defense position narrative ahead of trial proceedings. Addiction as a battleground. In court filings and public discussion, addiction did not appear as background detail, but as central infrastructure shaping the defendant's life trajectory and family dynamic. Records referenced in the official report describe substance abuse beginning approximately at age 15, marked by early exposure to heroin and rapid dependence. Repeated rehabilitation attempts followed, reportedly at least 17 in total, each representing temporary recovery followed by relapse. Family involvement was consistent, not passive. Treatment was pursued, relapses acknowledged, and boundaries tested. The documentary record reveals addiction not as an incidental condition, but as a continuous battleground in which the defendant and parents struggle for more than a decade. By adulthood, instability escalated. Periods of homelessness are documented, reflecting deteriorating function rather than concealment. Destruction of family property, referenced as prior behavioral incidents, further illustrates emotional volatility linked to substance use rather than calculated hostility. Addiction emerges as both personal disorder and relational fracture, influencing perception of motive, responsibility, and moral weight. Legally, however, addiction does not exempt culpability unless it eliminates capacity to form intent. The official report clarifies that such exemption is rarely met. Shifts to how addiction history intersects with premeditation. Prosecutors often argue that relapse, frustration, or financial conflict could trigger violent escalation, supporting deliberation if conduct shows sustained action. The defense, conversely, may frame addiction as impairment, not choice, asserting judgment collapse rather than planning. Treatment failure does not legally excuse homicide, but it can influence sentencing. The film Being Charlie, co-written by the defendant and his father, stands as contextual evidence that addiction was long acknowledged. The story mirrors real struggle, cycles of treatment, denial, and relapse. This is not offered as proof of guilt or innocence, but as record of known deterioration over the years. Addiction becomes a narrative battleground where prosecution sees motive potential and defense sees impairment. Neither conclusion is confirmed in official report text. Courtroom testimony will determine interpretive outcome. During penalty phase deliberation, addiction may serve as mitigating factor. California statute allows jurors to consider psychological disorder and substance dependence as reducing moral blame even when not eliminating intent. If charges are proven, addiction history could redirect sentencing away from death eligibility toward life without parole. Prosecutors acknowledge addiction is present, but may argue danger persists regardless of treatment failure. Defense may portray relapse as evidence of illness beyond voluntary control. It is plausible, based on official report detail regarding failed rehabilitation, that escalating family tension surrounding relapse contributed to emotional rupture. If addiction instability intersected with unresolved conflict, violence may have emerged suddenly rather than through extended planning. This remains theoretical and awaits court-confirmed evidence. In legal framing, addiction shifts from personal issue to evidentiary lens. Was the defendant acting under emotional collapse or deliberate decision? Did relapse amplify conflict until physical violence erupted? Under California law, premeditation can form quickly, so addiction does not automatically negate murder intent. However, jurors often weigh addiction narratives heavily when evaluating moral culpability. They may reserve death sentences for cases framed as predatory or sadistic, not those rooted in internal breakdown. Courtrooms often become arenas in which addiction stories compete with statutory standards. Prosecutors must prove capacity to choose. Defense must demonstrate impaired judgment. Sentencing outcome hinges on which framing resonates. As trial approaches, addiction history will move from biography to argument, shaping how jurors understand responsibility and consequence. A mind under scrutiny. Following the indictment, attention shifted from crime scene reconstruction to psychological evaluation, where questions regarding mental stability, decision-making capacity, and behavioral deterioration became central. Official report references indicate that Nick Renner failed to appear in court on December 16th because he was deemed medically or psychologically unfit. This detail altered the legal landscape immediately, transforming the trial from a strictly evidentiary process into a psychological inquiry. The fact of absence due to mental incapacity stands as the first official acknowledgement that mental health would shape courtroom expectations as much as forensic evidence. Mental assessment is not a formality in capital-eligible cases. Under California law, competency determines whether a defendant can understand proceedings, consult counsel, and participate rationally in defense. Psychological instability does not equal legal insanity, but it can delay trial or generate mitigation later. Scrutiny of mental health becomes procedure necessity rather than narrative detail, compelling psychiatric evaluation, record review, and history reconstruction. Courts require competency before guilt phase can proceed. Centers on whether mental deterioration preceded violence or followed it. The official report notes maternal concern prior to the incident, suggesting emerging instability. Whether this instability impaired reasoning or enhanced volatility remains undisclosed. Addiction history intersects with psychological assessment, as prolonged opioid use may induce neurochemical imbalance, depression, or paranoid ideation. However, to meet insanity criteria, Impairment must eliminate ability to comprehend actions or moral difference between killing and not killing. In official report analysis, defense may introduce long-term psychiatric history during penalty phase rather than guilt determination. Treatment records, hospitalizations, or medication history could shape juror interpretation. Psychological scrutiny becomes less about innocence and more about how punishment should reflect mental decline. Even when violent conduct is intentional, cognitive erosion may reduce perceived moral clarity. Experts in forensic psychiatry would examine prior behavior, communication patterns, relapse timelines, mood instability, and impulsivity indicators. Evaluations may involve neurocognitive testing, structured interviews, and collateral witness input. Toxicology reports could confirm recent substance use or withdrawal state. The official report does not specify diagnostic labels, leaving open whether conditions such as major depressive disorder, substance-induced psychosis, or bipolar instability were considered. Competency restoration via treatment could be required before proceedings resume. One theoretical possibility is that defense counsel will argue diminished capacity resulting from addiction and psychological deterioration, seeking to reframe violence as collapse rather than calculation. This remains speculative pending expert testimony and court records. Legally, a not guilty by reason of insanity plea demands high proof. Defendant must demonstrate inability to distinguish right from wrong during act. Prosecutors typically counter through evidence of purposeful behavior, such as fleeing scene or weapon disposal. If Nick left after the incident, prosecution may argue awareness of wrongdoing, undermining insanity defense. Official report information mentions arrest away from scene, possibly implying movement inconsistent with total cognitive break. Even without insanity, mental health functions strongly in sentencing. California juries often weigh illness as mitigating factor, especially when violence occurs within family context rather than predatory setting. Under special circumstance conviction, sentencing narrows to death or life without parole. Mental instability often pushes jurors toward permanent imprisonment over execution. Societal trend emphasizes containment rather than retributive finality when psychological collapse is documented. Psychological scrutiny thus becomes dual lens, evaluating legal competence and shaping penalty perception. The courtroom will examine whether mental disorder explains conduct or merely accompanies it. Prosecution may highlight consistency and repetition of stabbing to establish intent. Defense may counter that addiction impaired judgment beyond rational control. Outcome will hinge on expert testimony. Neuro, the siblings speak in the aftermath of the indictment. Public attention shifted from forensic evidence toward the family members who survived the tragedy, particularly the siblings whose voices now carried weight in the legal, moral, and emotional dimensions of the proceedings. Their presence marked the first time the narrative moved beyond crime scene analysis into personal testimony, grief response, and the uncomfortable space between loyalty and accountability. The most striking element was not a denial or defense, but quiet acknowledgement that two parents were gone and a brother stood accused under the gravest statute California maintains. The sibling statements did not alter charges, yet they influence how prosecutors measure community impact, victim wishes, and sentencing trajectory. In capital-eligible cases, family input is considered during penalty evaluation, especially when special circumstances mandate either life without parole or death. Deepen as observers question whether the siblings would demand maximum punishment or advocate for compassion due to shared blood and history. Public reporting referenced concerns a family expressed before the incident regarding Nick Renner's mental decline and addiction relapse, suggesting they were not unaware of crisis escalation. Turned toward whether the siblings would frame events as betrayal or collapse, and whether forgiveness or condemnation would shape the court's emotional atmosphere. Family testimony in such cases frequently becomes symbolic, not for determining guilt, but for defining moral tone of sentencing. Their statements, as reflected in official report context and public summary, emphasize loss without spectacle. The tone was measured rather than accusatory, reflecting awareness that the accused was not an outsider, but a brother once loved, supported, and creatively linked to the family legacy. This was not only a murder case, but a family divided between grief for parents and the irreversible reality of a surviving sibling facing lifelong imprisonment or capital exposure. While court filings prioritize statutory evidence, jurors often weigh family sentiment heavily. When relatives oppose death penalty, prosecutors sometimes reconsider seeking execution to avoid compounding trauma. In this fictional case scenario, available context suggests the siblings' voice may sway legal direction, particularly if they request closure without prolonged appeals. In California, one juror retaining doubt about death suffices to impose life without parole. It is theoretically possible that the siblings, grappling with dual loss, might advocate for life imprisonment rather than execution, arguing that addiction and mental deterioration contributed to psychological collapse. This interpretation remains speculative pending direct testimony. Their role in courtroom proceedings extends beyond sentencing preference. They may provide background on family dynamics, history of treatment attempts, emotional patterns, and final interactions before December 14th. Their memory of the Christmas gathering dispute may inform motive analysis, even if motive is not legally required. Sibling testimony regarding past warnings, pleas for intervention, or moments of reconciliation could support mitigation. Conversely, statements describing fear, destruction of property, or past violent episodes could strengthen aggravation. The law recognizes that victim impact narratives intensify gravity of homicide. When siblings speak, they speak for the deceased. Their words may describe a home that deteriorated slowly under addiction pressure until structure collapsed. Grief, not anger, may guide tone, yet grief itself carries weight. Jurors witness human cost beyond legal statute. Courtroom strategy splits as the preliminary hearings advanced. Procedural focus shifted from the investigative record toward emerging trial strategies, with prosecution and defense preparing for a contest defined not only by facts, but by interpretation, burden, and framing. California homicide litigation often evolves into two parallel narratives, one built on statutory evidence and one constructed through human context. The most striking development was that both sides signaled readiness to argue contrasting theories of intent, premeditation, and accountability, marking the first clear divide in courtroom posture. The prosecution approach, based on filings already submitted, centered on 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstance multiple homicide enhancement, supported by allegations of deadly weapon use. This legal structure enables the state to pursue the most severe penalty authorized by statute. Prosecutors typically emphasize knife attacks as evidence of deliberation due to repeated action required, intensified as observers recognize that conviction under Penal Code 190.2 leaves sentencing only between life without parole and death, creating high stakes for both sides. The defense, led by counsel familiar with capital litigation, appeared poised to construct a mitigation-based framework rather than pure factual innocence. Public information references addiction history, mental decline concerns, and prior attempts at rehabilitation, focus on whether counsel will pursue a diminished capacity theory, push for psychiatric evaluation, or reserve mitigation for sentencing rather than guilt phase argument. In modern California climate, where death penalty enforcement is moratorium-bound, defense strategy often aims to establish enough doubt regarding mental stability to prevent execution, even if guilt is proven. Public reporting of medical unfitness for early court appearance added complexity, suggesting potential use of psychological evaluation motions. Procedural filings may request mental health assessment under California criminal competency protocols. Regardless of guilt phase outcome, the true courtroom battle can merge in penalty phase, where personal history and breakdown narrative collide with statutory aggravation. Both sides know that a single juror resisting death is enough to impose life without parole. Prosecutors may anchor argument on repeated knife use, post-incident flight, and absence of forced entry or self-defense indicators. Such elements construct a narrative of conscious action, not impulsive outburst. They may assert that multiple stab wounds demonstrate persistence, satisfying intent. Defense may counter that addiction deterioration undermines cognitive control, arguing emotional implosion rather than planned homicide. Mitigation does not excuse conduct, but reframes moral classification. A plausible theoretical strategy divide could position prosecution to highlight planning inference from weapon selection and sequential victims, while defense seeks to attribute conduct to mental destabilization and relapse pressure. This is only a theory grounded in official report context, not confirmed legal strategy. The courtroom split extends beyond guilt. Prosecution must maintain narrative clarity free from speculation, presenting physical evidence, autopsy findings, and timeline cohesion. Defense may scrutinize chain of custody, toxicology context, or psychological history. In pretrial landscape, plea negotiations can materialize if both parties deem life without parole sufficiently punitive and administratively efficient. However, if trial proceeds fully, jury psychology becomes decisive. Cases involving parent victims evoke community gravity, yet jurors frequently resist death where addiction and mental illness shape trajectory. Courtroom tone may oscillate between legal precision and emotional testimony, especially when sibling statements enter record. When verdict arrives, media attention will likely fade. Headlines will shrink, but within remaining family, silence deepens rather than lifts. Justice does not restore life. It recognizes harm formally, defines guilt legally, assigns penalty permanently, and stops there. Healing is separate. Closure is uncertain. The case continues. Long after arrest reports faded from nightly broadcasts, the legal machinery continued without pause. Court calendars marked hearings in slow increments. Discovery motions expanded case files by the hundreds of pages. Toxicology documents, mental health evaluations, and forensic analyses were added into evidence lists, each one a fragment of the narrative that investigators believe unfolded inside the Brentwood home. Public attention moved to other headlines, but the courtroom did not. Within that building, the future of a single defendant remained suspended between statute, precedent, and jury deliberation. No trial date has been set with final certainty. The timeline remains vulnerable to expert availability, psychiatric review, and procedural negotiation. In capital-eligible cases, preparation is exhaustive. The prosecution must secure every evidentiary link to withstand appeal scrutiny. The defense must establish mitigating context thoroughly, supported by clinical testimony rather than assumption. Bench conferences refine instructions. Voir dire will determine whether jurors are willing to consider both death and life without parole. The reality stands clear. Progress exists, but resolution remains distant. The moratorium on executions continues to shape expectation rather than eliminate uncertainty. A death sentence is possible under law, but life without parole is the likely practical endpoint a conviction is reached. California juries increasingly favor permanent incarceration over symbolic execution. Arises not from who committed the act, but from how the court will choose to define justice. Sentencing is no longer merely punishment. It becomes a statement of moral interpretation. For the remaining family, this is not just litigation. It is loss without finish line. Statements in future hearings may describe life before the crime, life after, and what cannot be repaired. Grief does not align with judicial structure. Will understanding emerge, or will the case remain a record of harm without reasoning? Legal files answer what happened. They do not answer why. Appeals are probable even with conviction. Capital-eligible decisions often generate review. Habeas petitions can extend cases for years. Expert testimony may be reinterpreted. Mental health findings could shift legal perception. The system ensures caution in irreversible penalty determination. Accountability is the court's work, but finality is not quick. Evidence is cataloged in storage. Yet questions remain outside those folders. Each ruling narrows outcomes, but none revive what was lost. The case continues not because of delay, but because closure is structurally impossible. In future sessions, courtroom may focus on motive framing, substance relapse history, psychological decline, and whether emotional collapse removes or merely reduces moral culpability. Defense may lean toward mitigation through addiction and mental deterioration. Prosecution may present repeated stabbing, dual victims, and absence of forced entry as reflection of intent. Both narratives coexist legally until verdict. Public memory often seeks simple storylines. Courtrooms rarely provide them. Tragedies involving family rarely resolve into clear morality. Accountability exists, yet clarity does not. Some cases remain open even after sentencing, not in law, but in memory and discourse. Even if sentence becomes life without parole, effect is not conclusion, but continuation through years of incarceration, visitation rights, and psychological evaluation. The family, once united, will live separate lives. Anniversaries will come. Headlines will return briefly during trial, then fade again. Emotional residue does not fade with them. In legislative discussions, cases like this often reappear as references in debates about mental health intervention, long-term addiction support, or reform to prevent collapse before violence. Policy evolves slowly, shaped by tragedies documented in files similar to this one. The story does not close at verdict. It transfers from courtroom to culture. It continues in how systems respond, how recovery programs adapt, how families recognize early fracture, and how society defines accountability without erasing complexity. Some tragedies end with sentencing, others echo beyond paperwork. In the end, this case stands as a portrait of brilliance and devastation intertwined. A family known for art, culture, and legacy brought to silence inside their own home. The evidence, the indictments, the hearings, the medical findings, each piece forms a narrative the law can interpret, but not fully understand. Addiction left scars that treatment could not erase. Mental decline moved in shadows no camera recorded. And a night meant to carry holiday warmth instead collapsed into irreversible loss. If the court confirms guilt, the sentence will likely be permanent. Life without the possibility of parole ensures accountability, yet offers no restoration. Justice can define responsibility, but not repair absence. 2 lives ended. 1 life stand behind bars, fractured beyond return. And a community watches as a legal process searches for truth where no truth feels whole. Hollywood will remember Rob Reiner for the stories he told. His family will remember him for moments that will never repeat. The case continues through motions, testimony, and time, but the loss remains fixed, untouched by verdict or penalty. Some endings resolve. Others remind us that justice can close a file, but not a wound. A case without a motive. Among the most striking features of the prosecution record is the absence of a formally established motive, a gap that neither indictment filings nor early hearings have filled. California law does not require proof of motive to secure conviction for first-degree murder, yet motive often shapes public comprehension, jury interpretation, and sentencing deliberation. Without a clear narrative for why such violence occurred, analysis turns to fragments. A documented argument one day prior, long-term addiction struggles, deteriorating mental health, and the collapse of family systems stretched across years. The shock rests not in what is known, but in what remains unexplained. 2 parents dead, a son charged, and no confirmed reason recorded. Investigators confirmed no financial gain indicators, no external intruder conflict, and no ideological or retaliatory purpose within public reports. In many domestic homicide cases, motive surfaces through digital messages, patterns of threats, or documented disputes. Yet available context here reveals only fragments rather than conclusive chain. Rises from silence, as courts proceed without a motive narrative that normally anchors prosecutorial rhetoric. In jury settings, motive strengthens perception of deliberation, while lack of motive may either confuse or redirect emotional weight. Public reporting references a heated exchange at a Christmas gathering hosted by Conan O'Brien one day before the incident. Witness accounts noted intensity, but no official report confirms subject, trigger, or escalation details. Pivots to whether this argument represented culmination of years of unresolved strain rather than isolated explosion. Addiction relapse patterns often generate internal conflict, but no court filing has connected dispute to homicide with evidentiary certainty. Mental health instability introduces further ambiguity. Records suggest concern from mother days before incident, and defendant was deemed medically unfit for initial hearing. Competency issues do not equal motive, but they complicate inference. Motive absence forces courtroom strategies to rely on conduct rather than explanation, intensifying scrutiny on stabbing frequency, post-crime movement, and timeline rather than emotional backstory. Prosecutors may argue that lack of motive does not weaken case when evidence of intent appears through weapon use and repeated action. Defense may counter that absence of motive suggests emotional implosion rather than premeditation, supporting mitigation over capital penalty. Domestic homicides without motive often place jurors between rational evidence and emotional discomfort. A crime can be proven beyond reasonable doubt without explaining why it happened, yet verdict psychology often revolves around meaning. A plausible theoretical interpretation grounded in official report context only, is that accumulated family pressure, addiction relapse, and psychological deterioration intersected without documented trigger, producing violence not rooted in coherent motive but in breakdown. This remains theory, not fact, pending trial evidence. California courts differentiate motive absence from motive contradiction. No digital manifesto, inheritance dispute, or planned retaliation has surfaced in record. Silence leaves space for sentencing influence rather than guilt dispute. If no motive emerges, prosecution may highlight legal sufficiency of conduct-based intent. Multiple stab wounds, 2 victims, no intruder sign, and post-event flight suggest awareness. Defense could emphasize collapse narrative to deter death penalty. Cases of this nature often conclude not with answers, but with legal resolution that lacks emotional closure. Without motive, families face grief unanchored by explanation. Trial cannot restore meaning where motive never existed in documented form. Permanent outcome. No piece as indictment filings matured into procedural scheduling. One reality settled across court records and public commentary alike. The final result of this prosecution, regardless of verdict form, will not restore what was lost inside the Brentwood home on December 14, 2025. 2 lives ended, 1 life now bound to the judicial process, an entire family fractured with lasting consequence. Under California Penal Code 190.2, conviction under multiple murder special circumstance restricts sentencing to death or life without the possibility of parole. The statute removes intermediate discretion. The stark truth stands. Even if convicted or even if mitigated, no sentence can reverse the night both parents died. Legal inevitability does not equate to emotional closure. Proceedings may determine accountability, but accountability is not equivalent to healing. Should guilt be proven, life without parole would ensure permanent confinement, but permanence in law does not mirror peace for family. Arises from the paradox that justice can be delivered while resolution remains absent. In capital cases involving relatives, punishment often resolves state interest, yet grief continues unbound by verdict form. Mitigating evidence of addiction history, mental deterioration, and relapse patterns suggest defense may argue collapse rather than calculation. Prosecution is expected to assert premeditation through repeated knife use, dual victims, and post-incident movement, forms around which narrative jurors will interpret as morally decisive. If even one juror rejects death, life without parole becomes mandatory. Even a plea agreement would preserve permanence without spectacle. In California, plea to LWOP is common in cases that involve severe aggravation but emotional complexity. The state avoids prolonged appellate litigation. Victims' relatives avoid repetitive trauma of hearings. Yet plea itself does not answer core question. Why did the violence occur? That absence of motive returns continuously. The unresolved emotional void. Legal closure seems assured, but meaning remains elusive, and meaning is what families search for long after cameras withdraw. A grounded theory based on official report context is that outcome probability leans toward life without parole rather than execution, due to mental health instability, addiction trajectory, and California moratorium environment. This theory reflects sentencing climate, not confirmed decision. If life without parole emerges, the defendant will remain confined permanently, with no parole hearing and no procedural return to community. California courts emphasize public safety and finality in LWOP, especially in domestic multi-victim cases. Death penalty remains legally available, but is rarely enforced in current climate. Even if jury selects death, execution remains suspended under moratorium, meaning sentence becomes symbolic rather than functional. For the surviving siblings, the process ahead includes impact statements, sentencing participation, and lifetime identities shaped by the dual loss of parents and brother. Under statutory effect, property, estate transfer, and civil implications may follow criminal phase, extending legal consequence beyond incarceration. Court rulings provide framework, yet families continue living within shadow of unresolved questions. Permanent punishment resolves only state responsibility. It cannot address what cannot be undone. Absence of voices, holidays unshared, projects unfinished, generational gaps that will never close. Courtrooms adjudicate facts, but family trauma extends outside legal boundaries.